Grav dropping in that kills everything? It's like 7th edition all over again. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the competitive-minded 40k channel where we're currently all about getting the most out of your Space Marines. Now this is part 2 out of my Devastator review, where we're going to focus on one particular build for the Devastators, that is a unit of Devastators with 4 grav cannons in a drop pod. Now this build has been doing the rounds a bit in several competitive lists, as it's basically a very hard hitting punch that you can do right from the start of the game if you need to. I thought it was suitably different to the standard Devastator squad loadout to talk about in its own video. So what does this unit involve? Essentially, at bare bones, you would take a 5-man Devastator squad, buy 4 Devastators with grav cannons, buy an Armorium Cherub for the squad, so one Devastator can shoot twice with that 2-up ballistic skill from the Sergeant, and buy a drop pod for them. And drop pods are 65 points, including the Stormbolter. You then drop this in on the first turn that you can get to anything nasty, and when you do come in, you pop the Gravitic Amplification Stratagem from the new book, which we'll come on to in just a second. So just to recap, that's 5 Marines, 4 with grav cannons, a Sergeant, which you could take something like a Stormbolter on if you wanted. That's come in a drop pod. The drop pod can come in turn 1 anywhere outside of 9 inches of enemy models, because it is exempt from the Tactical Reserve special rule, which means reserves only have to come down turn 2 or turn 3. This means that you have the option of turn 1, 2 and 3 for this guy. I believe you can't keep it later, seeing as they did an FAQ about that. So this lets you add quite a lot to an Alpha Strike, with those 4 Devastators getting out with grav cannons and absolutely hosing a hard target. The grav cannons profile is 24-inch range, heavy 4, strength 5, AP -3, 1 damage, but if your target has a 3-up armor save, then the damage becomes D3 instead. If your army is either in the Devastator Doctrine, or you drop it in turn 1 when they'll always be in the Devastator Doctrine, then that AP will go up to -4, which is even nicer. Already with just that base loadout, if you drop in and target something like a Space Marine Rhino, which they're only wounding on 5s, you'll still do on average about 7.5 wounds to it. But it's that stratagem that really makes this unit awesome. The stratagem is 1 CP and it's called Gravitic Amplification. Use this stratagem when an Adeptus Astartes unit shoots with any grav cannons and grav amps. Until the end of that phase, you can reroll the damage roll. Now this is a really strong boost on a weapon that has a relatively low strength, as on a 5+ rerolling, that will actually turn into you actually wounding the target most of the time, even if you're targeting something heavy like a tank or a knight. Obviously, if you pointed at anything toughness 5 or lower, that means that you'll be wounding either 3/4 of the time or 8/9 of the time, which is crazily good. And then re-rolling that D3 damage, you can re-roll any results of 1, netting you a few more 2s and 3s there. So for 1 CP, this really translates to a lot of additional damage. That Rhino that we were targeting earlier that was taking 7.5 wounds, now will be taking 14.5 wounds if you use this stratagem on the squad that's otherwise completely unbuffed aside from the Cherub and the Devastator Doctrine. So provided you actually can get range on the unit, this unit could one-shot, say, a Leman Russ tank commander, which would be a massive loss to your opponent if they lost it turn 1. Seeing as this base squad only costs 215 points, then you've almost earned their entire points back in 1 strike, and any effort the enemy has to spend to kill them is just bonus value. If they get to fire again, then you're absolutely definitely in the money. Now this is the base squad, but there are a few ways that we can buff it up. One of the biggest weaknesses of the squad is that, as it is coming out of a drop pod, the heavy weapons will be moving and suffering that -1 to hit modifier. So if you can play as Ultramarines, or as Iron Hands with their super doctrines, then the grav cannons will be counted as stationary and not suffer that -1 to hit, which is massive. Iron Hands in particular are very good with this, because they reroll 1s with heavy weapons while they're in their super doctrine, so that's giving them 2 different damage buffs for free if you're part of a pure Iron Hands army. Just by being in the Iron Hands Devastator Doctrine, then that Rhino that we were doing 14.5 wounds to, with the stratagem, now goes up to 22 wounds with Iron Hands and using the stratagem and the loadout we discussed. So you're now fairly comfortably killing any 2 3-up save 10 wound vehicles on 1 strike. You could drop these guys in, try and take down a couple of really hard things, then use the rest of your long range firepower to chip away any wounds that were left on the vehicles. This is getting in the territory where you're doing quite significant damage to an enemy knight now. Even if the knight has a 4-up invulnerable save, then on average, an Iron Hands Grav Devastator squad with that stratagem and the cherub and the signum will be doing on average 11 wounds to a knight that has rotated iron shields and is on a 4-up invulnerable save, and that's pretty mad for one unit of Space Marines. Most of the other chapter tactics and boosted doctrines don't actually add a ton to this. As I said, Ultramarines move and shoot is great, but you want to drop them down turn 2 when they're in the tactical doctrine, but they are a very good pick for Ultramarines. Raven Guard's anti-character +1 to hit and wound is actually great if you're going against knights, who are typically upgraded to be characters, or other character heavy hitters such as tank commanders or Lord Discordants and the like. If they're targeting a character heavy hitter, then Raven Guard are actually just as strong as Iron Hands, provided they're in their boosted doctrine of having +1 to hit and +1 to wound. The Raven Guard Grav Devs can also be -1 to hit if you set them up in cover when they get out of their drop pod, which is a decent survivability boost on a fragile unit. The other chapters don't really have tons and tons of reasons to take Grav Devs as them themselves, but if you are playing an army from another chapter, I still think this Grav Devs in a pod loadout could well be worth it just because they're so strong as is. Now there are a couple of ways that we can think about increasing this damage output further. If they're Iron Hands, then I typically might just leave them cheap as it is, as they're already sort of buffing themselves by their own bonuses. Otherwise, a Captain could be good to reroll those ones to hit. You can also include them in the drop pod. A Company Ancient could be a really powerful choice to include, as these Grav Cannons are pretty fragile and I suspect that the opponent will eliminate them as a priority target once they've dropped in and made a nasty mess of one of his prized units. So having a couple of Grav Cannons fire off in the opponent's turn could be a very nice thing to have. Grav Devastators was also really like a Chaplain buff, but because of the way the Litanies of Battle work, the Chaplain would have to start on the board at the start of the battle rounds to activate the Litany of Battle. You couldn't just throw him in the pod as well. If you do manage to coordinate with, say, like a Jump Chaplain moving up to buff these guys, then the +1 to wound or +1 to hit bonus could be useful. Finally, if you did want to put all of your eggs in one basket, you could put a Chapter Master in the pod, as this would be particularly useful for an army that doesn't ignore the movement penalty for the heavy weapons, as being able to reroll all 1s, 2s and 3s is a very good boost on their damage output. If you're doing this, I'd probably try and coordinate with other units coming in from reserve, so the Chapter Master can buff them too with his aura. Talking of other units, we do actually have some other options, because we have 10 spaces in the drop pod, and the Devastator base loadout only takes up 5. Now you could just leave it empty and leave these as a single massive punch, that would be absolutely fine, but if you did choose to take advantage of it, there are a few more options, which I've already seen some people do, but I think if I were doing this, I'd seriously think about just buying the other Grav Devastator squad a different drop pod, so you can drop them in on a different turn. The reason for this is that Gravitic Amplification Stratagem is the real reason to take this unit. You can't use it twice on 2 squads in one turn, so you may as well drop one in, use the strat, and then drop another one in the next turn, use the strat. So if you're wanting more Grav Devs, I'd take a second pod. You could buy a few more Tactical Marine bodies to shield your Grav Devastators. This would actually force your opponent to dedicate more than just a small amount of firepower to removing the unit, which they definitely are going to want to do once they've seen what they can do. This would raise the chance of the Devastators living to fire a second time, which would only increase their value, but obviously the bodies do cost extra points, which are a finite resource. If you did put another squad in the pod, I'd certainly consider something like Company Veterans with Storm Shields and Storm Bolters to provide some extra anti-infantry support, or some Stern Guards to get out and mow down some Xenos with those boosted bolter ammunition types. If you are including, say, a Captain in the pod to buff the Grav Devastators, it might well be worth tuning him up for close combat a bit, say giving him a Power Fist and try and attempt a 9-inch charge on something nearby. You will be throwing a Captain into the forefront of the enemy lines, so you might as well give him something that can actually do some damage when he's there. As you've probably guessed, the Iron Hands variant is my favourite. I'd be looking to drop them in turn 1 if possible. If they can reach a hard target and knock it out early in the game, and that will stop it from contributing to every single turn of the battle, which could be a powerful blow early on. I would probably set up the pod just so the Devastators can just get into 24-inch range to keep them as far back from the enemy army as possible, to hopefully give them more chance of survival. If you have the option, certainly get the Devastators out into cover. A 2-up armor save in cover is a lot better than a 3-up out in the open, and it's often free to do this. From there, you're just going to have to hope that these guys survive. In all honesty, they almost certainly won't if the enemy has good target priority. These guys are fairly fragile for a very high potential damage output, so if the opponent leaves them alive, then they've kind of made a mistake. Now there are some counters to this unit to be aware of. Firstly, 24-inch range isn't really all that long. With a couple of infantry squads, it's entirely possible could screen out all of their heavy hitters from your grav devastators. This might be a reason not to drop them in turn 1 if they've already moved up their infantry and the devastators have no solid targets. From there, you seriously want to think about eliminating all of that infantry so they can drop in and deliver the punch that you've paid for. If these guys are dropping in and only mowing down some guardsmen, then they're almost certainly not going to be doing the amount of damage to the enemy to justify their points cost. Also, there is one thing to be aware of with drop pods. If the enemy charges your drop pod and doesn't kill it, then they've essentially made one of their units immune to your shooting for a whole turn, because unfortunately your drop pod can't fall back. Now this could potentially be very, very damaging to you indeed. So if you are using drop pods and you're thinking of dropping them anywhere near where the enemy can charge them, I'd try and make sure you have some counter assault units to scrape off any hangers on to that drop pod. The other weakness of this squad is that they just really aren't that tough to enemy firepower. If they turn anything serious in terms of guns with decent AP on them, then they'll just evaporate. So unless that you position them well out of line of sight of a lot of guns, they're likely to be a one-trick wonder. For this reason, it might be good to drop them at a point in the battle when you're also threatening the enemy with a bunch of your other units. If you give them too many threats to deal with in one turn, then there's a reasonable chance the grav devastators might just live. Overall, I think the unit is highly competitive, and I've already seen it cropping up in some nasty lists. My main concern about it is that against a good player, you could well be screened out from doing any damage at all with it, if they have enough infantry. But recently I have been seeing a lot of lists that just focus around taking almost nothing but heavy hitters, so you can actually get a drop on the army and get the devastators close enough to deliver their nasty payload. So I certainly think that they have a place in the current meta. Let me know your thoughts on the unit below, and if I've missed anything that could be important to the unit's loadout. Thanks again for listening to Auspex Tactics. Feel free to subscribe for similar content to this, and I'll see you guys in the next video.